Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. It's great to see such a good group of you here in Missoula. This is our third part of our 9-city tour, and it's always great to be home here in Missoula. I'd like to welcome all of you to the 41st Annual Economic Outlook Seminar presented by Northwestern Energy and the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. My name's Patrick Barkey. Since 2008, I've been director of the Bureau, and I'll be moderating today's program. It's hard to tell anything about the economy from your television set during what I call the silly season, which is the political season. Believe it or not, the economy has been growing for going on 7 years. And consumers are starting to feel better about it, even if oil producers and grain farmers are not. The question is, will the confidence of consumers and the momentum that we have in 2015 be enough to push through some of the challenges we see ahead for another growth year this year? We have a full slate of folks here to talk about exactly that question, and we're looking forward to their presentations. Let me tell you a little bit about the Bureau before we get started. The Bureau of Business and Economic Research is the research arm of the School of Business Administration at the University of Montana. It was begun in 1948, and since then has been involved in a wide variety of activities, including economic analysis and forecasting, survey research, and what we're doing today, information dissemination. We also produce the Montana Business Quarterly, to which many of you now subscribe. You'll notice some extra copies of the Montana Business Quarterly out there. They're free. And I know there's a lot of professors in the audience, and they'd like to hear that word free, and so I just thought I would tell you that. I think you'll notice some additional information about the Bureau on the inside of our Montana Economic Report. I invite you, I'll close this ad by simply saying, invite you to contact us if we can be of any service to you or your organization. As you can see, we have a number of sponsors for these seminars, and I'd like to take a little time right now to recognize them. Starting with our principal sponsor, Northwestern Energy, our statewide sponsors, Benefis Health Systems, First Interstate Bank, represented by Tom Severson over here. Thank you very much, Tom. BNSF Railway, Republic Services. Matt Bauer, I believe, is here someplace. Are you, Mac? Max? No? Being shy? As well as local sponsor, Missoula Chamber of Commerce. Their sponsorship is one of the major reasons we're able to bring these seminars around the state. We greatly appreciate their support, and if we could take just a moment to show our appreciation. We're very pleased this year to release our first edition of a new product, the Montana Economic Report. This is our annual assessment of the performance and the prospects for the state and local economies, as well as an in-depth look at some of the issues that will be important for our outlook. The report is really in response to your feedback. It's a mechanism to allow us to cover more topics than are practical in the space constraints of the program. The printing and distribution of these reports was made possible with the support of the Office of Commissioner for Higher Education. And once again, I'd like you to join me in thanking them for their support. We also have a number of organizations which have accepted this program for continuing ed credit. If you qualify for one of these, if you've registered for one of these, you know the drill. You sign up outside, and we give you your certificates later. To comply with the requirements of that, I'm going to read briefly the list of organizations for which we qualify for CE credit. They include the Montana Society of Certified Public Accountants, Institute of Certified Management Accountants, Society of American Foresters, Montana Department of Education, Teacher Professional Renewal Units Program, Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, Montana Board of Realty Regulation, Montana Insurance Continuing Education Program, HR Certification Institute for PHR, SPHR, and GPHR, Montana Board of Social Work Examiners and Professional Counselors, Montana Board of Nursing Home Administrators. All these groups have approved our seminars for credit. Welcome to those of you attending for credit. You should get your certificates from us in 4 to 6 weeks. As usual in this program, we're going to take apart the economy. We're going to take apart the state economy, the local economies, and the major industries in the Montana economy in various presentations. We've allowed time for questions after each presentation, and we have folks with microphones to help us so we can all hear the questions during the course of the program this morning. I'd ask you to please hold your questions until the presenters are finished, and we'll get to as many as we can. Most of our presenters have PowerPoint presentations, and their slides are in your presentation booklets you have in front of you. They'll also be available for download at our website at the end of next week. Well, I just want to take a moment to frame our topic of property taxes, because when Benjamin Franklin uttered his famous quote about death and taxes, you could be pretty sure he had the property tax in mind. After all, the tax has been around for almost 500 years. And there's a good reason why governments have taxed land and property for all that time. And that's because it's pretty hard to move your land. You're captive to pay the property tax. It's an old tax. It's impossible to escape. But that doesn't mean we like it. And in fact, one of the things that holds us back from changing the property tax and making it a better tax is the fact that it's a complicated tax. And yes, we're going to get into this a little bit, because it is necessary to understand what forces are making the property tax change, what forces are making your property tax bill different perhaps from your neighbors or your kids in another city. And so we're going to get into some of these details, talking about the terminology of property tax, but with one purpose in mind, so we can understand it and we can make it work better. You know, but one of the real reasons why we think this topic is so appropriate for this audience and for this time is because property taxes are universal. It's something that affects all of us. Of course, if you're a homeowner, you know property tax, you get the bill in your mailbox, but maybe you have it put into escrow and maybe it's part of your mortgage payment, or in Missoula, with a high proportion of renters, you don't think you pay your property tax, but it is in your rent. Landlords are paying it, and they're passing along a portion of it to you. In fact, it's everywhere. When you go up and down Reserve and you shop, you're paying property tax in what you pay for your merchandise, because that's part of the business costs of those folks who stock that inventory and bring the goods up for sale. In fact, it's been in the news lately that your property tax is in your utility bill. And I believe our friends at Northwestern Energy have a poster outside showing how much of your utility bills are actually property taxes. It's more than 10%. It's rather astounding. In fact, if you run a business, property tax is part of your bottom line. Is it helping us stay competitive? Is it a detriment to our competitiveness? This is a question I think is relevant to talk about for this audience, especially because property taxes are also growing. We know lots of things in the economy are growing in dollar terms. That's the way the economy is. But even after looking at things like inflation and population, evidence shows that property tax, at least in most communities, is growing, and that's not necessarily bad. I mean, property taxes pay for things like schools, streets, and safety that we value, but we need to understand why it's growing and whether or not that growth can be sustained. So we really need to know what's going on, and that's why we're excited to have this as our theme of this year's program. Just to alert you to how this is going to work, our keynote address will be at lunch, and we have an outstanding speaker who will make these concepts really very understandable. And when we get done, we'll know why property taxes are growing and where we stand, and I really look forward to hearing our keynote presentation. My task this morning for the rest of my talk here is to talk about the state and national economic outlook. And really, the thing we need to understand about the economy today is it has taken a while, but we have reached full employment, both here in Montana and in Missoula, as well as in most parts of the country. And this is where we want it to be. But as we look back at how this happened and what the most recent year was like for starting with the national economy, it's been disappointing. But it's been disappointing for 7 straight years. So even slow growth in the world's largest economy eventually adds up. I think one of the disappointments this year was a lot of people had arguments at the beginning of last year as to whether low gas prices were going to be merely fantastic or utterly fantastic for the economy. People were looking for a big breakout. People were talking about how much extra money consumers would have. Well, guess what? It didn't really happen. It didn't translate into a real spurt of growth like people thought it would. I think one of the big stories of 15 was the fact that we really started to see evidence of slowdown abroad. We've heard a lot about Chinese stock market turmoil. You haven't heard so much about some of the other indicators of a global growth slowdown, which has really manifested itself right here in Montana in a stronger dollar. And guess what? Canada's just across the border, and the stronger dollar really does matter. I think we've seen a year of 15 where the U.S. job growth engine just kept humming along. Even in the fourth quarter of the year, when it looked like growth was stumbling, and indeed the growth report that came out this morning is hardly enlightening, encouraging, with less than 1% growth, we still see U.S. job growth really pushing through. And so we've started up what I call this virtuous cycle in the U.S. economy, where you see spending growth by consumers, which is leading to businesses adding capacity, adding workers, hiring, which in turn brings on more income growth and more spending. So it's a nice circle, which really, when the economy gets to this stage, it has momentum. It can't go on forever, but it is something that we work to get towards, and I want to tell you that we've arrived. And that cycle has been set up, and it's a good thing for the economy. One of the things that's helping that is that slowly and very quietly, behind the scenes, we're all starting to borrow again. All of us in this room, governments, and companies. Companies have been borrowing for quite a while, but I think we're seeing an ease of credit for all kinds of things, be it furniture, cars, or even houses. 7 years of growth cures a lot of problems. I've shown this graph in the past. It's a little busy, but it makes a very simple point. This is the U.S. economy, and this is trying to understand how we have fared in recovering from the recession. So first off, everything on this chart, which is a little busy, it's all about the labor market. So it's all about workers and how many are working, how they're being put to work, and what people expect for the future. And the way this chart works is you step through time, you measure a whole bunch of different aspects of the workforce. You measure what employers are actually doing in the upper right-hand corner, the confidence of both workers and employers in the lower right, how much the labor force is being utilized, part-time, full-time, et cetera, lower left-hand corner, and then some measures about what we think we're going to see going ahead in the upper left. And the way this chart works is you start at a point in time when everything was good, before the recession even began, 2007, and you give those a baseline represented by the circle. The second baseline is the worst point. So the end of 2009 was the trough of the recession when all of these measures were bad. And so that becomes the starting point. And as we march forward from 2009 with the data shown on this graph, we get a sort of a picture of how much we've recovered. And what you see from this picture is we've recovered quite a bit. So I'm just going to put 3 years up here. In 13, now you see where we're going with this, that's where these measures stood. So the leading indicators had already surpassed where we were in 07, whereas some of the other measures, particularly utilization, still had a ways to go to get back to where things were before the recession. But now you see, as you march forward to 14 and finally the close of last year, you can see by many of these measures we have either equaled or substantially surpassed where the labor market was in 07. So I put this picture up not to tell you that we're firing on every single cylinder, but by and large, the labor force in the country has recovered. We're now growing over and above where we were before, and that's really good news. One of the things which stands in our way, though, of future growth is what's going on with our currency. And let me show you how much more expensive U.S. goods and services are today than they were just 1 year ago. So Europeans who are buying our goods and services, our exports, or Europeans who are coming here to Montana to spend money on our services and goods here, are paying almost 9% more. Canadians are paying almost 20% more, 20% price increase for our Canadian friends. The pound, not so much, yen, very little. Chinese currency, about 6%. And then you get the countries like places like Brazil, which are really in the tank right now. And you can see that U.S. goods and services are 50% more expensive for Brazilians, and there's a few hundred million of them down there, than they were just a year ago. So really a big change, and it's showing up in terms of some of the business prospects of global companies based here in Montana. One of the things that's really flown below the radar in the stories of the economy is how much the nature of growth has changed. It's not the amount of growth. If you look at total growth in the U.S. economy, and economists love this measure, GDP, the big picture growth item, that's what these 4 dots show. It's basically growth in the last 4 years, and it's really largely unchanged. It's lower than we would like. Some years a little lower, some years a little higher, but really not much variability here. It's the same old story with the U.S. economy, 2% growth, give or take. But the nature of that growth is quite a bit different today. In fact, the amount that consumers are contributing to growth today, as shown by these blue bars, is much higher. So this is really today much more of a consumer-led recovery in economic activity, whereas just a few years ago, you can see the business spending, the investment part, was really holding the economy up early. That was things like oil field investment, tech investment. These things have cooled off. Consumers are picking up the slack. What are the other 2 pieces? Well, they're a little smaller. One is government, and government was a drag on growth earlier because state and local governments in particular were very cash-strapped and cutting budgets. But now you can see government is starting to spend a little bit more than it has. And when I say government, that's all levels of government. The last side of it is trade, and trade, as you can see, has deteriorated markedly because of the strength of the dollar. So it's the same growth, but it's really a different kind of growth today, and we'd be wise to know that. The big changes, of course, have occurred in commodity markets, and we remain a natural resource state in many respects, particularly in some parts of our state, and this is really important. If you look at the overall index of commodity prices, now commodities includes, this is the whole enchilada. This is ag commodities, metals, energy, even lumber is in here. And you look at these commodity prices, you can see the big decline, but you notice the nature of that decline. It occurred in 14, and then it seemed to level off. And then the last 3 or 4 months of 2015, we've seen some accelerating declines, which have continued right to this day. In fact, that is showing up both on non-energy commodities, so this is just the piece that takes out energy, and the energy commodities where we see things like oil and natural gas and coal and the other energy commodities are in there. And notice that the nature of that, the pause and then the renewed acceleration. We're back now to about 2004 levels of commodity prices. And so that's just a completely new era for many, many Montana businesses who are in that business or they're supported by that business activity. One commodity that's particularly of interest to a lot of people in Montana, particularly since it fuels state government, is what's going on with oil. In the case of oil, we all know that oil prices have fallen significantly, crude oil prices, gasoline prices, diesel prices, et cetera. What's been the effect of that? All right. Well, it's been a bit of a puzzle. Part of the puzzle is, this is not part of the puzzle. What these bars represent is investment, okay? Total spending in oil field activity, measured in dollars. This is actually an index. And you can see that big decline by the 4th quarter of 2014 when the realization that these lower oil prices were not a temporary phenomenon. Producers began to cut back, and it's about a 40% decline in investment, which is pretty significant. Not quite as big as this rig count total. Rig count is something a lot of us have learned what rig counts are in the last few years. It's simply the count of the drilling rigs used to, particularly in the fields like the Bakken in Texas and so forth, the rigs that are drilling new holes for new production. So those rigs in the field have been at much higher levels, but you can see when the oil price declined, those rig counts have fallen a lot. And you would expect with all that production would be hitting the skids, but it's actually not. Production has only grown more slowly. There's been some monthly declines in production, but you can see the big picture, at least through the third quarter of last year when we have the total data, it's only bent the curve. It hasn't really brought production down. What that means is that U.S. producers are more efficient, and Terry Johnson will talk a little bit about this. But what that really means is going forward with the big picture forecast, low oil prices are likely to be here for a while because, in a sense, producers are part of the problem. They're pumping a lot of oil still, even though prices are low. They're not reacting as fast as we thought. In terms of what's important for Montana, the commodity price story is a little bit sobering. I've shown these commodity prices in the past with this little graph that you can think of like your temperature gauge on your car. And where the cold is the 5-year low for the particular commodity I'm looking at, the hot end of the scale is the 5-year high, and the readout is the most recent monthly average. So I have some individual commodities here which are of importance for Montana. This first one is lumber, and commodity prices for lumber have actually fallen back in recent months, but you can see relative to the 5-year history, right about in the middle. Not so for the ag commodities. The ag commodities are all just about at 5-year lows. So I have barley, beef, and wheat. Even though beef is still fairly high, a pretty good price, $1.67 a pound, it's quite a bit lower than it has been, as you can see. And that's part of the story. That's one of the things making that overall commodity price index go down. On the metal side, oh my God, they're all at the 5-year low. Every single one of them, copper, palladium, zinc, and of course I have oil on here, not a metal, but an important commodity. So that's where we stand. This is very important for many communities. We've seen it in the news, the closure of some of the mines, the layoffs at places like Stillwater. This is showing up in the economy, and it's certainly something the economy has to work through. One of the things that's kind of throwing this big wrinkle into the commodity growth, price growth, and the currency changes and all the things I've been talking about is what's going on in China. And I put the question on this graph, does anyone know what Chinese growth is? Because this is the official data. It's a nice, smooth, orderly, harmonious economy. Well, it's down from 7 to 6.9%, all right? Now, it's interesting, Paul Polson in my office and I, we talk about this, and Paul, you know, China's composed of a number of provinces, and the interesting thing is that all the provinces in China are above average. I think those governors are paid for their economic performance, okay? So this is kind of funny data. So the rhetoric that you hear is, well, you know, even if growth isn't as high as this, it's still pretty good, and we really shouldn't worry. But that's kind of an empirical question, right? How much lower is actual growth? And so one consultant has looked at growth and estimated growth from things which are independently observable and verifiable. So things like rail car shipments, manufacturing exports, electricity sales, things that you can actually measure and you don't have to rely on the government to give you. And they suggest that growth has dipped as low as between 1% and 2% during some of the recent turmoil. So the reason why I put this graph up is that what happened in the financial crisis was that the economy got a surprise. And the surprise was all of these mortgage-backed securities that we thought were just blue chip, they weren't. And that was not good for the economy, as we know. I think the global economy doesn't like surprises either. And as this surprise, if this is indeed the case, if this comes through markets, that's going to be a shock. And that's going to be something which is going to be difficult for the economy to process without causing some pain in some places. So just to finish up on the U.S. economy, let me just say that it's consumer spending that's really doing the work. The old fuel is spent. We've seen evidence of a global slowdown. I haven't talked too much about the Federal Reserve. We had liftoff, and the rocket flew about 100 feet up. Interest rates went up last year, as we all predicted, and they just about had to if the Federal Reserve is going to have any credibility. But, you know, with GDP growth coming in at, what was it, 0.7% this quarter, it's hardly a real good case to keep raising them. There is an interest rate forecast in your Montana Economic Report. You can see that, and it's very restrained. So, yeah, interest rates are going to creep up, but not much. The question is how much longer we can continue to go it alone. We have healthy job growth. We're the envy of the world in many ways, and it's because of the U.S. consumer doing the work. And the question is how much longer. Well, let's turn to talk about what's going on in Montana. The Montana economy at full employment is an economy where growth has shifted west. So growth is here in Missoula, growth is in Ravalli County, growth is in Flathead, et cetera. It's a different pattern of growth. I think the labor market has really worked out most of the slack. The low-lying fruit of workers available for your openings is largely gone. And most of you know that. You've been telling me that for the last year. The broad growth means that it's difficult to describe exactly what's powering it. It's easier to tell you what's not growing in the state economy than what is, because just about everything is. That's boosting tax revenues, and it's also helping boost wages. We've talked already about some of these headwinds. I talked about those in the U.S. economy. And I'd like to spend just a couple minutes in the rest of my presentation talking about a couple things I don't normally talk too much about. Construction I do talk about, but retailing. Retailing as a measure of economic activity. Well, let me give you a little bit of insight into where the Montana labor market is. I'm going to do this in a slightly different way than I've done in the past, and maybe some of you do. The unemployment rate is probably the one statistic that all of you know. I mean, you know a 10% unemployment rate is bad. But if I told you growth was 3%, you'd go, I don't know, is that good or is that bad? I don't know. So the unemployment rate is okay. I like to look at this particular measure. It's unemployment claims. And the reason why I like it is because it's not a survey-based number. It's actually a count. It's a count of the people who are collecting unemployment insurance in Montana. And it's a measure of the health of the labor market. It's a little bit funny because it has this behavior over the course of the year, and that's why I put it up on a graph. You see these months, January through December. For one particular year, 2013, you can see the typical pattern in this number. It tends to be higher in the winter and lower in the summer. And that's mostly because of the nature of demand for seasonal employment. All right? The important thing is how does it change from year to year? So now let's march forward in time, and you can see this has got lower in 14. Lower claims, healthier market. In 15, I only have it through November. You can see it's better yet, although it is starting to bottom out in terms of the improvements. So that's really, we're coming down to lower and lower levels of slack available workers, at least by this measure. How low are we getting? Well, one way to maybe answer that question would be just to pull a graph out from our history, 2007, of the same measure. And you can see that we're getting pretty close to where we were in 07, where a lot of communities in Montana had unemployment rates of 2% or lower. So it is starting to show up like a tightening labor market. Another measure is what's going on with wages. And I think this is a good story for workers, maybe not so good for employers. First off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the growth in jobs in the blue bar and the growth in wages. Now, what I mean by wages is total wages paid to all workers. So that's hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm going to correct it for inflation because I'm showing growth in percent. So there's the growth bars in 2012. In 13 and 14, you can see those growths were close to being equal. There's no magic number that says they have to be equal, by the way. But they were more closely aligned. Then when we get to 2015, we saw a big breakout year for wage growth in Montana, whereas job growth was pretty much where it's been all along. So that, to me, is evidence that Montanans are working more hours. That would increase wages. There's more Montanans working. That increases wages. But also, they're also bidding up the wages, particularly in occupations where workers are in shorter supply. So we're seeing evidence of that, and that's the story, and that's a different picture we've seen from Montana than we've seen in the past. Well, what's driving that growth? Here's the quick synopsis, and it's largely everything, all right? So I've put up some industries here, and I can't put them all up, so I've done some combining to give you a little insight into what kinds of things are working for the Montana economy right now. I've got two bars here. They both represent this total wage growth. For particular industries, the blue bar is what happened in 14 and the red bar is 15. So let's start out with construction and manufacturing. And by the way, in this particular graph, I'm measuring things in millions of dollars. So you can see how much these industry groups I've selected are contributing to overall growth. The larger, the more contribution. So quite a pickup in construction and manufacturing. Manufacturing is everything, and Todd Morgan will talk a little about that. Construction has been both non-res and residential construction in different parts of the state at different paces. Retail and wholesale trade, another acceleration in growth in 15. Matter of fact, they're all like this, pretty much. Okay, financial and business services, look at that contribution to growth. A lot of tech is in here, not just tech. Everything from lawyers to accountants to scientists and engineers. All kinds of services are in there, as well as the finance folks who are largely doing better because the housing market's doing better. Healthcare has picked up growth. Accommodations and food have increased growth. So you see it's the same story. Even government, which had been shrinking, has swung over to growth in 15. The only exception here on this particular graph is what's going on in mining, which in this category includes oil production. So that's the story with what's going on in the east. Other is everything else. Quite a bit of, I mean, it's you see what I'm saying? It's just about everything. I haven't cherry-picked these very much. I always cherry-pick them a little bit. Let's take a look at what's going on with construction. Something which has been long awaited, and it really hasn't quite arrived yet. But these counties which are in the red are the counties which have the most housing starts. Now I say housing starts, not building permits, because in our research center, we construct our own housing start measure. It's based on both building permits and utility hookups. And the latter is there to account for the housing starts that occur in jurisdictions that don't require permits, which are fairly significant in some parts of Montana. So this is kind of a population story. If you look at these permit numbers, these housing start numbers, you can see how the red dominates in the west, the gray being the smallest counties by and large. But some of these numbers are fairly healthy. Missoula's in the 200s. I can't quite read it from here. Gallatin and Ravalli, all these counties are doing pretty well. But like I say, it's largely a population story. If you take that same housing start number and you keep score a slightly different way, in other words, you take a look at the number of housing starts as a proportion of where we were in the peak year, which happened to be 05. Then you see most of the red shifting to the east, and that nasty gray color comes back here to roost. And what that means is that we still have a long ways to go for our housing starts to get back up to where we were in 05. We probably will never get there. Maybe we shouldn't get there. That was kind of a frothy time, and we paid a price for that. But this just gives you a way of keeping score of that. And you can see a lot of these western counties which are seeing better growth, still to calibrate that, it's not quite as good as it used to be. Let me talk a little bit about what's going on with retail. Now, forecasters rarely talk about retail simply because we feel that retail is a follower of the economy, not a driver. Now, that's not literally true. There are sources of growth in retail that come from folks who visit Montana, mail order and all kinds of things that can spur the economy through retail sales. But largely as the economy goes, so goes retail. But since this has been a consumer-led recovery, I thought it would be useful to take a look at retail sales as a measure of how Montana consumers are feeling about the economy. And of course, we don't have a sales tax in our state, and some people are happy about that, some people are not. But it doesn't give us that measure of retail sales, literally, that we'd like to have. So I'm going to keep track of retail by the wages paid to workers in retail industries. And first I'm going to start with Montana, and you can see the remarkable recovery in retail in Montana that's taken place in about the last year and a half. It really has been a nice boost upwards that's powered both by visitors and by Montanans themselves, buying more merchandise from bricks and mortar stores. What's going on with Missoula is also encouraging. You can see in the case of Missoula, this is a familiar pattern where the recession, and this is not a measure of the recession, by the way, but the recession declines and things like the closure of Smurfit caused us to be just a little bit slower getting out of the gate. But notice that pretty impressive growth. You can see if you look very closely that line for Missoula, at least the trajectory, is faster than the state. So the growth in retailing in Missoula, a little stronger than the state, even if we still have a little ways to go to erase the gap caused by our later entry out of the gate. So what's ahead for Montana's key industries? Well, I think some of this I've already talked about, but let me just summarize. I think in Montana, statewide, construction, manufacturing, visitor spending, these are bright spots for the economy. I noticed the governor just came out with a report yesterday, Montana Economic Development Report. Whew, glad you didn't call it the same as ours. That was close. You know, and the governor's report is very upbeat, as you would expect. But my comment was, well, he picked a good year to write that report because he had a lot of material to work with. I mean, there's a lot of things you can pick out about the economy that are doing well. I think the worst of the impacts for energy still lie ahead. I think there's been a challenge of energy producers to be the last man standing, if you will. And, you know, there's going to be some more pain there in the oil patch, and we'll feel that. Ag producers, George Haynes will be up here in a few minutes to talk about what's going on there. It's a completely different environment in agriculture. You saw those prices. I mean, it's different than it's been in the last 5 years. It's not different than anything ag producers have ever seen. I think one of the stories that's important for Missoula, because we do have a government presence in this town, is that pressures on governments at all levels have eased, local, state, and federal. So you look at the federal government, you look at they passed a highway bill, passed a budget. They seem to forget how to have spelled the word sequester, let alone follow it. It's a different kind of environment right now, and that's important because it is a change from what we've seen in the past. I think the stage is set for broader growth. It's there, it's ahead of us if nothing derails it. Plenty of things could, I've mentioned them. So just to summarize in terms of where we see growth for the state, this was the picture of growth that we saw at this presentation last year. So these three numbers are data. The first two numbers are data, and the third is our forecast. Forecast of what? Well, it's a forecast of non-farm earnings. So that's wages and salaries, that's proprietor income, that's benefits, that's everything that households receive that's related to their jobs in terms of income. Corrected for inflation, what we saw, we predicted in 15 that growth would pick up significantly. What happened? We got some new data. The new data for 13 are strange. I'll be the first to tell you, but they're official. I can't do anything about them. They say it's zero growth in 13. I think that'll be revised away. It doesn't correspond to anything we can see. The revision of 14 was upward. It looks like 15 is even going to come in stronger than we thought. So we picked the direction right, but we were a little bit low in terms of our forecast of 15. Going forward, we think growth is going to stay right about between 2.5% and 3% for the out years. I think the next couple years are going to be really key for us as we digest the new global growth environment, the new commodity growth environment, and as we change gears to what's been driving the economy in 2011, 2012, to what's driving the economy today. Very different forces, but we think the outcome will be fairly similar. So I'd be happy to take a question or two. I'd like to see the people on my staff work off their calories by walking around with a microphone. So I would ask, who's got the first question for me?
It's interesting to look at the housing, single-family home construction tilts. It looks like Gallatin County's 3 times Missoula's or area, 300 versus 900. Kalispell and Yellowstone around the 700s. What's making up the big difference between the areas?
Well, we'll have more insights on that in the real estate presentation, but I will tell you there's two things. The first is that, and I'm really kind of stealing Kyle's thunder, I hate to do this. The first thing is it's multifamily housing. So multifamily housing, so you build a building that has 40 units, it's 40. Okay, that's because that's the score we're keeping track of, how many units are being built. And so multifamily housing tends to push the number up in a particular year and down. So that's part of it, all right? But the other part is that simply their housing is in fact stronger. Their housing growth is stronger than Missoula's. Why is that exactly? It's a topic of discussion. Maybe Paul will have some words on that. But I guess what I'm saying is that growth gap between 200 and 700 or whatever it is, part of that is explained by, some multifamily coming on board in those counties, growing faster. But part of that is the underlying economy. So in terms of explaining what that is, you have to look at the growth drivers in each community. Paul Polson will be talking about that a little bit. Another question over here.
On your currency graph, could you explain or speak to the reason why the yen is going the opposite direction of most currencies?
Okay, first off, yeah, that's a good question. It's probably above my pay grade. I'll do my best. First thing you need to understand about currencies is they can't all be stronger. I mean, if some are stronger, some have to be weaker. I mean, that's just the first thing. And all currencies are measured on what's called an exchange-weighted basis. So the Zimbabwe currency does not get much weight because very few transactions take place. So in terms of why the yen is getting that, now I've given myself time to think about the answer, right? I probably really don't know. Other than I definitely don't know. I can't even come up with an answer that will hold water for right now. Other than that's the way it looks. Let me think if I can think of anything particular about Japan. I mean, there's a lot going on in Japan. Certainly, they just lowered their interest rates to negative territory this morning, so their economy is kind of sick. Japan is a funny animal because they have a lot of debt, but it's all owned by Japanese. So a lot of these currency swings occur as the banks involved are doing policy. So, for example, in Europe, they're printing money. They're printing money and buying bonds in Europe, the so-called quantitative easing. I don't know if you've heard about that. And the U.S. has stopped doing that. And so that's one reason why the euro got weaker. In Japan, those kind of policies tend to have less effect because there's less, from their perspective, foreign debt. Okay, that was a very long answer to say I really don't know. Other questions? Yeah.
You talked about in recent years how consumer spending seems to be filling the gap on the overall growth. And then you talked about the easing of credit. People are borrowing more. Where we were positioned before the recession started with borrowing, are you concerned about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're concerned about debt, but not so much in the U.S. We're concerned about debt in places like China, where it's doubled in the last 3.5 years, which is pretty shocking, although their data is always questionable. It's interesting, Alexander Hamilton, the guy on our $20 bill, or $10 bill, which bill is he on? I can't remember all of a sudden. He was one of the first to realize that debt can be good. Debt can be good. I mean, when consumers take on debt, it's a sign of confidence. And confidence is good because consumers are all individually seeing their own future and they feel good enough about to take debt. So there is a signal there that taking on debt is at some stages, at some levels, it's not that universally bad thing. Oh my God, I can only eat what I produce today and that kind of thing. It's not the kind of economy we work in. It's not the kind we've ever had here. So I'm not concerned about U.S. debt growth. It has a long ways to go before it would be a concern. There was one more over here. Yeah.
So what is the ideal sustainable growth rate in an economist's perfect world? 2 to 2.5% seems kind of boring, but it's pretty steady. 12% is not sustainable. So what is that number?
Yeah, there's actually a whole lot of economists that think about that exact question. And from an economist's point of view, the best growth for the economy is the one that gets right up just to the point where you don't cause inflation. Because I must admit, I've been an economist all my career, and we like growth. We think growth is good. Growth is what gives us positive interest rates. Growth is what helps us fund our retirements. All, you know, we have that bias. We like growth, all right? I've admitted it. So that's the ideal rate of growth. Right now, we have almost no inflation. I didn't even mention inflation in my whole talk, I don't think. So we could grow a whole lot more than this. So the ultimate number in terms of numerically used to be 2.5%, 3% was about right. It now looks like since the recession, we're sort of at a permanent situation of 2% growth. So, but the ideal number is a moving target, but that's the criteria. If we get too much growth and we get inflation, that's very bad for the economy. So let's pull up short of that. Take one more. Yeah, right here in the middle, Bob. Or what have you got? Uh-oh.
Yeah, Pat, is there anything to be concerned about with the Montana and the federal labor participation rate?
Okay, when you say federal, you mean the total labor force participation rate? Okay, sure. Yeah, the economy's back to full employment, but full's not what it used to be. All right. Now, by the way, that's more true nationally than otherwise. So, in the recession, a lot of people left the labor force. Some of them retired early. Some of them lived with their spouses or their parents. Some of them went on Social Security disability. You look at all those numbers; they're all up. And so, the unemployment rate measures based on the available workers. And when that workforce is smaller, that is something that is a big concern. That's why a lot of people think the economic growth is slower, because we've lost those people permanently. I will say that in Montana, that's not as pronounced. I'm not saying we've snapped right back to where we were before, but we haven't seen the same kind of decline in the overall workforce participation rate as we've seen nationally. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if you have an economy that goes through the worst recession we've seen since the 30s, you're going to see some people try to do something else while the economy is bad. So we saw enrollment at universities go up. We've seen all kinds of people putting off getting into the labor force, doing different things, be it, going to school or, living with their parents in their basement. What are they doing down there? I'm not sure. But we, by the way, we have an interesting part of our program. We have a rebuttal. We're always poking fun at millennials, and we have a millennial on the program who's going to rebut all of the snide comments we're making. But the short story is that labor force participation is pretty strong in Montana. It's historically been stronger here than in the U.S., but especially in the U.S. economy, it's a big concern. So the problem when you're your own moderator is you go over, and I try not to go over too much, but this has been a terrific discussion. I thank you very much. We're going to now turn to take a look at what's going on in the Missoula area economy in Ravalli County. And to do that, I'm happy to bring back up, for the 41st year, our Director Emeritus. We join me in welcoming Paul Polson.
Thank you very much, Pat. Now, the Great Recession had very different impacts across Montana. But as we get further and further away from the recession, the economic trends are starting across Montana are starting to converge. And that's also true for our seminar cities, where we track individual economies. Now, here's the latest data. The last 15 quarters of data for each of our seminar cities. Now, the media experts say that this is exactly the kind of graph you shouldn't use, because you can't really see individual trends. But when we look at the most recent data, we see that the urban areas in Montana are all performing in about the same range. But two of them stand out. The first is Gallatin County. They're on top. The Bozeman area economy has been growing on its own path since the Great Recession ended. The second, Cascade County, Great Falls economy. They're at the bottom. The Great Falls economy had been lagging, but if you look at the trend since 2014, you see that the Great Falls economy is now almost up to the middle of the pack. Now let's look specifically at what's going on here in Missoula. We start out by putting up the statewide average. That provides us with a benchmark. Here's the Missoula economy. Just looking at the most recent data, the Missoula economy is performing just about on average. And you'll see that there's a slight deceleration there in the first half of 2015. We also look at Ravalli County. There's actually some life in the Ravalli County economy now. You can see that that its growth is right on average in looking at the other areas. There's Yellowstone County. Now, right after the recession, the Yellowstone County economy was one of the fastest growing counties in the state. But you can see that growth has modified, and it's now somewhat, or it's right in the about the statewide average. Here's the Flathead County economy. Notice that it's growing above average. But as good as things are in the Flathead County, they don't compare to what's going on in Gallatin County. And you can see that acceleration in growth in the last couple of years. That big bump out there in 2012 was when Oracle, or when Right Now Technologies sold out to Oracle, and many of the employees exercised their stock options. There's the Cascade County economy. You can see the relative slow growth of this stability in 2012 and 2013. A couple of new manufacturing firms opened and added employees in 2014, and you can see the acceleration there in the Great Falls area. The Butte-Anaconda economy. Now, of all these urban areas in the state, the Butte-Anaconda company is primarily affected by commodity prices, copper prices, and that directly impacts the bonuses that are paid by Montana Resource, or paid to Montana Resource employees. There's the Helena economy. The relatively slow growth in the Helena economy has been due to the wage freeze on state employees and the general overall slow growth in the state government employment in Lewis and Clark County economy. Let's look specifically now at Missoula. These are the basic industries in Missoula. This is what makes the Missoula economy tick. These are the industries that bring in new funds from the outside the state, outside the county. And as forecasters, we know that if we can get a handle on these basic industries, our forecast for the overall economy is going to be quite close to the overall mark. Now let's start off with construction. Construction is not a basic industry, but construction was a major component of the economic trends during the last recession and since the recovery began. Well, it looks like we finally have a little life in the construction industry here in Missoula. The first half of 15 was very strong. But before we get too excited about construction, just wait a minute. This has occurred in the past where we've had fits and starts with the construction industry. But at least looking at the latest data we have for construction, the first part of 15 looks very good. Now, the largest single component of the economic base for Missoula County is the University of Montana and other state agencies. Well, the outlook isn't good. With the decreasing enrollment and the layoffs at the university, we're not going to be seeing much growth coming from this particular sector. Trade center, medical. Now, this is not all of healthcare. This is only that component of healthcare that services non-residents. That's responsible for bringing in new funds into the Missoula area. In the last several years, we've noticed some very interesting things about healthcare in our major urban areas. They're not growing as fast as it used to be. This used to be a major source of growth here in Missoula. It's relatively stable now. Most of the growth in healthcare are now in the secondary markets, the Kalispells, the Bozemans. And this stability or slow growth in healthcare, or the trade center component, is also occurring in Great Falls, and it's also occurring in Billings, the other major centers. The federal government. The federal government employment has actually been declining since 2011, and we'll come back and talk about that for a minute. The latest data for 2015 shows a moderation in that decline. So we're projecting approximate stability for federal employment here in Missoula County, but we'll have more to say about that in just a minute. Trade center, other services. These are the lawyers, the architects, the accountants that are serving non-resident customers out of their base here in Missoula. Transportation, here in Missoula, that is trucking and railroads. There has been a definite softening of both of those industries. Why? Because of that worldwide economic travail that Pat was talking about. There are simply fewer goods being transported across Montana now than there were before. Non-resident travel, we're looking for moderate growth. Wood products, a much smaller industry right now, and the supply of saw timber is still one of the major issues. Trade center, retail, and wholesale. Again, this is servicing the non-residents who come to Missoula to shop and do business. We're looking for approximate stability here. Other manufacturing. Now, this is the real bright spot. This is there are a number of new manufacturing firms that have located here in Montana, are opening, have opened, and are adding employees. They include things like Harris Manufacturing, Alcom, that's the trailer manufacturer, Montana, CM Manufacturing, and Spectrum Aquatics. Let's go south and look at the economic base in Ravalli County. Again, starting with construction. Construction in Ravalli County is bouncing along the bottom. It hasn't bounced above the bottom, and we don't see any change in trend. Now, the best news for Ravalli County is that Missoula County is now growing again, because the largest component of the economic base in Ravalli County are commuters. Those are people who live in Ravalli County but work here in Missoula, and they spend in Ravalli County. The federal, the second largest component is medical research. That's the Rocky Mountain Lab and GlaxoSmithKline. Now, some of the research functions at Glaxo have been sent elsewhere, but the production facility is still going full guns. Federal government, again, we're looking at stability at best. Manufacturing, the big component there is armaments. Wood products, this is primarily siding and log homes. They're now serving a nationwide and a worldwide market with their products. Ag and non-resident travel, non-growth, and other. Okay, how does this translate then into a forecast? Let's start with Missoula. You can see that relatively strong 2.9% growth in 2014 and 2015. We're looking for continued growth but deceleration. Why? Because of the impact of the events at University of Montana and also because of the weakening transportation industry. Looking at Ravalli County, you can see that slow growth that was occurring during the earlier years, an acceleration up to 2.6% in 14 and 15, and we're looking for a slight slowdown. Maybe some of that's caused by the slowdown here in the Missoula County and looking at the out years. How does growth compare across our Montana cities? There's the statewide average. You can see that two cities are projected to grow above average, Flathead County and Gallatin County. You can see that growth here in Missoula and Ravalli County are expected to average about 2.1% per year between 2016 and 2019. But the thing to really notice is how close these growth rates are. That's simply another reflection of what Pat was talking about, continued moderate growth, but a broadening of it. It's occurring across the state. Now, if you had a chance to look at the research report that you got when you came in, you may have noticed there an article about the federal government. Here in Montana, federal employment declined almost 6% between 2011 and 2014. that decline in federal employment was widespread. It occurred each year during that period, and it occurred in almost all of the major urban areas. Now, this is important because the federal government is a major part of the Montana economy. Yet, in many cases, it provides a buffer to buffer the effect of the more volatile industries. Normally, the federal government is stable or has slight growth. That acts as a counterbalance to the more volatile industries in Montana and in each of our individual cities. Now, I wrote that report in October. That was the deadline for the report, and I really didn't have time to delve into why and where the federal government is declining. I'm still not sure why it's occurring, but we do have more information on where and what is happening. Now, when you decide to look at the federal government and disaggregate the federal government, these are the kind of industries and sectors you come up with. Now, this is classic Fed speak. And you know what Fed speak is? That means you hear the words, but you don't really know what they mean. Look at those definitions. You can't really tell what is involved in each of those industries. So what I did was took each of these industries and look at its spatial distribution across Montana. Which counties are they located in? Let's start with executive, legislative, and general government. This is roughly proportional to the population. In other words, there are more of these employees in the bigger cities than in the smaller cities. Probably the easiest example of that are the local employees of our federal senators and congresspeople. Justice, public order, and safety. Here in Montana, these particular employees are concentrated along the High Line. That suggests to me that there are Border Patrol and immigration kinds of employees. The federal court system is probably also in that. Administration of human resource programs. Now, these jobs are concentrated in reservation counties like Roosevelt, Glacier, and Bighorn. So I think they reflect a lot of the BIA employment. Administration of environmental programs. That's where the Forest Service is located. That's where BLM is located. Administration of economic programs. Again, this is proportional to population, and this is where the temporary census workers were classified during the 2010 census. National security and international affairs. That includes the civilian employees at Malmstrom, plus the civilian employees of the Army Reserve and the National Guard, primarily located in Lewis and Clark County in Helena. Now, just to screw things up even more, when a federal job is identical to something in the private sector, it's classified in the private sector industry. So healthcare and social assistance. This is concentrated in Lewis and Clark County and also some of the reservation counties. So I think it reflects the VA hospital in Helena, plus perhaps IHS, Indian Health Service clinics out in the reservation counties. Museums, historical sites, and parks. These jobs are classified in Glacier, Flathead, and Park County. So that's the Park Service. And of course, the post office is obvious. Here's the numbers. Federal employment declined by almost 900 workers between 2011 and 2014. This works out to be a decline of just a little more than 6%. Look down those industries. Almost all of them have negative signs. So this decline in federal employment is occurring throughout the federal government, except one area, healthcare. So that suggests to me that the change in the federal government has been declining in all but one area, veteran services. In terms of absolute numbers, though, the largest decrease was in the Forest Service and BLM. Together, they lost 500 workers, almost half of the total. So what does all this mean? Now, we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out in the next couple of years. As of now, the only growing part of the federal government appears to be veteran services. Now, the federal government owns much of the land in Montana. The decreases in the Forest Service and BLM means that there are going to be fewer land managers and other professionals out there managing our federal land. We're probably not going to see an increase in the timber harvest, but these kind of decreases in our natural resource industry or natural resource agencies don't bode well for the management of our natural resources. So with that, I'd like to open for questions. In fact, I'd like to ask Pat to come back up, and you can ask either he or I questions. So, questions. Nobody? For Pat?
41 years he's answered it all.
Yeah, nothing left. Thank you very much.
Now we'd like to close this segment out with our first presentation on industry very important to Montana and especially here in Missoula. To hear the outlook for healthcare, I'm pleased to introduce the Bureau's Director of Healthcare Research. Join me in welcoming Bryce Ward.
Good morning. So I'm here to talk about the future of healthcare. However, before we dive into the future, it's always nice to take a little bit of a look back into the past. And as I understand it, the very first BBER Economic Outlook tour took place in 1976. It's convenient because I was born in 1976. And a lot's changed in healthcare since 1976. And to help illustrate that, I thought I'd share with you something that my parents shared with me recently, which is a bill for my birth. Now, I don't think they were giving me a bill because they're like, hey, you've got some scratch now, we'd like you to pay us back. Although I would understand if my mother was seeking compensation. I was a large infant, 10 pounds, 12 ounces. So, I would understand that. I've tried to be a good son. I've provided grandkids and the like. So, hopefully this was just a measure of, here's the bill for your birth. Isn't this kind of interesting? And when they gave it to me, because I'm a huge nerd, actually, hold on. Anybody want to guess what the number is at the bottom of this bill? I have, other than my size, it was a relatively normal birth. It was $532.50, right? So like I said, I'm a huge nerd, so when they gave this to me, I immediately, and I do mean immediately, pulled out my phone, went to the BLS inflation calculator so that I could adjust this for inflation, because I don't know what a dollar was worth in 1976. So adjusted for inflation, in 2015 dollars, $532.50 in 1976 is roughly $2,200. I don't know how many of you have given birth recently. I didn't do it, but my wife did it 3 times. In the past 5 years, and I can assure you it's not $2,200. It's more in the $10,000 to $15,000 range. So over the course of 40 years, in real terms, something that humans have been doing as long as we've been a species has increased in real inflation-adjusted terms by 500% to 600%. And that's the story of healthcare. Healthcare has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown at rates much, much faster than the rest of the economy, such that in most places, in the United States, healthcare is the largest industry, as measured by employment or payroll or output, and that's true here in Montana. And it got that way by growing faster than the rest of the economy. So, as you can see here, the black line, the solid black line, that's healthcare. The dotted line, that's the state total. And in almost every year of the past 25 years, healthcare employment has grown by more than the rest of the state employment. And the average has been, the horizontal line, so 2.8%. Versus 1.7% for the state, and 1.1 percentage points compounded over 25 years, it's a really big difference in how much healthcare has grown versus the rest of the economy. But in recent years, something has changed. You'll notice that over towards the right of the graph, the solid black healthcare line is well below its long-term average, and it's barely above the state. Right? This is true in Montana. It's also true nationally. Since the Great Recession, healthcare has been growing at a much slower rate relative to its historical average and growing much basically in line with the rest of the economy. And so the question for our, the talk today was trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future of healthcare is have we reached a new equilibrium? Is healthcare going to grow at roughly the rates of the rest of the economy? Or are we going to go back to where we used to be with healthcare growing at much faster rates than the rest of the economy? And, you might be sitting there wondering, well, you've seen Pat and Paul tell you about the future of the economy, and now I'm going to tell you about the future of the economy. You might be wondering, how is it that these guys know what's going to happen in the future? Humans have been trying to figure this out forever, right? We've had, wizards and prophets and sorcerers and tarot cards and crystal balls. How is it that economists have somehow magically tapped into the forces of the universe so that we can tell you what's going to happen in the future? So I thought I would share a little bit because it's actually come up. Several people have asked it in the previous parts of the tour. So it starts back in graduate school. As you might imagine, getting a PhD in economics is a very rigorous thing. When I went to graduate school, my colleagues and I, we all showed up 3 weeks early voluntarily so that we could attend something called math camp, which I can assure you is the greatest summer camp that you can possibly ever attend. Differential equations and linear algebra, it's awesome. And then immediately after math camp, we go right into on our first day, we walk into class and the professor's up there, he's like, this is boot camp. And you will struggle more than you've ever struggled in your life this year. And you go through boot camps, you learn macro and micro and econometrics, and you do general exams and oral exams, and you write a dissertation, you're getting ready to graduate. And it turns out, that no one's ever told you the answer to the question that you're going to get more than any other as a professional economist, which is, what's going to happen to the economy? And so I went to a very fancy graduate school, and so they sat us down right before we graduated, to have this big meeting, and they're like, look, you're about ready to go off into the real world. You're about to be, formally inducted into the priesthood of economics, and we want you to be prepared for this question that you're going to get. What's going to happen to the future of the economy? And so we're sitting through them, and all of a sudden, the bookshelves open up, and we're led down into this dark tunnel where there's like candles and incense and people chanting, and they're like, here you go. Here are the secret tools that you use to answer that question. And I thought I would, share some of those tools with you today so that you might, marvel at their power and glory. Behold, the magic Harvard 8-ball. Will the stock market go up today? Reply hazy. Try again later. Sorry. So I thought we would use the magic Harvard 8-ball to help predict the future. And you might remember a few weeks ago that the Powerball jackpot was like $1.5 billion. And my wife was like, we got to buy some tickets. And I was like, honey, I got the magic Harvard 8-ball. We've got some very well-placed bets for the future, And she's like, we've been telling me that for 10 years. So let's ask the magic Harvard 8-ball, what's going to happen to healthcare spending? Is it going to go back to growing at rates, above the rest of the economy? Yes. So let's see here. The official statistics from the government agree with the magic Harvard 8-ball. They must have their own magic Harvard 8-balls. And this is the forecast from the Center for Medicaid Services about what national healthcare spending is supposed to be going, for the next 10 years. After this period of kind of growing in line with the economy, it's projected to kind of go back up to the rates that it used to be, around 6% per year, and to grow at rates faster than the rest of the economy. So now, this is national data. Will this apply to Montana? Outlook good. You guys don't have a magic 8-ball. Sorry, you're not trusted with the power. But here, if you want to understand what's shaping the likelihood of healthcare spending growing back in line, with its historical averages, there's kind of three main forces: insurance expansion, aging, and healthcare innovation. So let's talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. So obviously, since the Affordable Care Act was, kind of fully implemented or more fully implemented in 2014, we've seen a large decline in the share of Montana's population that lacks health insurance. 2013, before ACA, Depending on the survey you looked at, the adult population between 18 and 21% was uninsured. We've seen this kind of steady decline. So the most recent data from about 6 months ago shows it now about 14.4%. Medicaid expansion is now live. Based on what we've seen in other states that have already expanded Medicaid, we'll probably lose another couple percentage points, or gain a couple of percentage points of insured people. Long term, it'll probably settle around about 10, maybe 9%, maybe half of where it used to be. And this has two big effects on the healthcare industry. First, when people don't have health insurance, they still get health care. And a lot of that care was uncompensated care before. And so when you provide people health insurance, then the amount of uncompensated care should fall. And obviously that will help the healthcare industry with its bottom lines. But secondly, when you give people health insurance, they actually get care that they otherwise would have skipped. And fortunately, some health economists recently put out a whole study in which they actually kind of said, look, here's how much giving people insurance will affect the utilization of healthcare in all 50 states. We have Montana-specific numbers. And what they estimated for Montana, I've picked out a few numbers here, but it's kind of roughly in the 4% range, maybe 4.5%. And you might think, well, that doesn't seem that big, but when you consider that healthcare is about an $8 billion a year industry in Montana, 4% is $300 to $400 million of new healthcare, of new capacity or underutilized capacity that will get utilized. And so obviously that will boost healthcare, the healthcare sector, going in the intermediate term. The big force, though, that's driving this kind of long-term trend upward in the projections of healthcare spending is just aging. We've been talking about the aging population in this country for a long time. The big event that we've all been focused on, which is the retirement of the baby boom, is upon us. Just a few years ago, only about 13% of Montana's population was over 65. Within about 15 years, that's going to be 23%, just based on the forecast, which of course can be wrong. But, so roughly a quarter of people over age 65 within a few years. And as you might imagine, the older you are, the more health care that you consume. And so if you just take, these old numbers from 2010 about, per capita spending by age group, and you apply them to, Montana's demographic forecast, what you see is the projection just from pure aging, no changing in how much we spend per person, is expected to add $2.3 billion to Montana's healthcare sector. Right? That's a huge inflection on something which I just told you is $8 billion currently, or a little less than that. So obviously, between health insurance expansion and aging, there's a lot of force pushing healthcare to grow over the next 10 to 15 years. The big unknown, though, is what's going to happen to this per capita spending. There's lots of forces that go into how much we spend per person. A lot of them are embedded in what went into this 600% increase in the cost of childbearing. But we also are trying to do things to slow that growth, and those are the questions that we don't know the answers to. Or you don't, I do, because I have a magic 8-ball, but I can't share that with you yet because I've got those bets placed. So anyhow, so the questions are: will price growth be contained? Will unnecessary care be reduced? And what's going to happen to technology? And technology can go in two ways. One is it can add really expensive new technologies, which are great because they can help us live longer, but they're expensive. Or they may figure out technologies which are cheaper to give us the same health for lower costs. We don't know. But the power of the first two forces and our historical experience with this third force give us pretty good confidence that healthcare spending is going to go back to rising over the long term. And so the question for Montana is, well, what does this mean for the healthcare sector and for Montana's economy in general? And the most immediate and obvious impact is we're going to need a lot of healthcare workers. The BLS does forecasts for every occupation. These are their 10-year forecasts, which I've applied to Montana. And, just in the next 10 years, the healthcare sector, the number of healthcare occupations is expected to expand by about 7,000 people. Right? So actually, that's a big number of people, almost 1,000 a year. But, we don't need to just add the new people. We're going to have to replace a bunch of the people who are in this baby boom that are going to be retiring. It can help you understand this. The average age of physicians and surgeons in Montana is the oldest in the country. Right? So we are going to have to churn over an additional about 16,000 healthcare occupations within the next 10 years. Right? So combined, the new jobs that are going to have to handle this aging of the population, the insurance expansion, whatever else goes on, plus the churning of the people that are, going to leave the healthcare sector and move on to other things, it's about 40% of our current capacity. Right? So obviously, if you're looking for a new occupation, and needed something that looks pretty robust for 10 to 15, 20 years, healthcare is probably not a bad choice. So we have to, go through that process of training and recruiting and attracting, and that's going to be the big challenge for the healthcare sector, is actually accommodating all of this growth. The next question you might ask is, well, where is it going to go, right? And healthcare is relatively concentrated. About 75% of the jobs are in Montana's 7 big counties. 80% of payroll is in those counties, and obviously it's heavily concentrated in Billings and Missoula. So it's likely to continue to be concentrated in those areas, although there is this underlying trend that's emerged in the last 10 years of the healthcare, it's starting to spread out a little bit, right? And that healthcare growth, healthcare sector growth has been faster in places like Kalispell and Bozeman and Helena than it has been in Billings and Missoula. And in particular, you'll see that the payroll bars, the light gray bars, are even bigger than the employment bars, which suggests that this is skill upgrading, right? The average wages there are going up, which basically means that there's more higher level skills being supplied in those places. So kind of the big picture of healthcare in Montana for the next 10 to 15 years is one of relatively solid growth, of likely a bit of diffusion out from where it's historical concentration in Missoula and Billings, but there will still be a lot of growth in Missoula and Billings. And with that, I'll ask the Magic 8 Ball one last question. Is this the best BBR Outlook talk of all time? You may rely on it. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
On the healthcare outlook. Let me phrase that a different way. Who has the first question?
I have a question. I have a grandson that's a junior here in the nursing program, the university. How do we retain these young people in Montana? Because there's a lot of competition. He's telling me, Grandpa, I'm going to go to San Diego or I'm going somewhere else. So how do we address that?
Okay, so in healthcare, it turns out that about 80% of the people who major in healthcare sector occupations at Montana University System schools will actually remain in Montana at least in their first year. So that's good, but you're right, there is competition from all over the place. And that applies not just to healthcare, it applies to everything. And as an economist, when we talk about why do people live where they live, there's 3 things that we talk about, right? We talk about income, quality of job, whatever you want to call it, cost of living, and quality of life. So Montana obviously is famous for its quality of life. It's very appealing. Lots of people want to live here. Montana's cost of living is about average. It's a little bit below average, so it's not great, but it's not terrible. The challenge obviously is on the income side. Right? How do we pay incomes in Montana that are high enough to that the young college graduates don't sit there and go, I can make more in San Diego or Portland or Seattle, enough more to compensate me for the higher cost of living and whatever differences in quality of life may be. And that's obviously the challenge that Montana has to struggle with and figure out. In healthcare, it's not as bad. The gaps are not as bad. If you're a nurse in Montana, the wages are below average, but when you consider, if you looked at all the occupations for college-educated workers, healthcare occupations tend to be about kind of 85 to 90% of national average, whereas, there's other occupations that are 60 for college-educated workers. And so, it's a little bit better in healthcare, but it's a wage story, right? It's how do you are you able to supply pay wages and charge prices that are consistent with those wages, and that's kind of the big challenge. Right here. Okay. Well, we'll do 2 questions.
Do you look at the overhead of healthcare delivery, that is non-direct providers versus providers, and what does that tell you if you do look at that?
Well, unfortunately, I don't get to, dive into the healthcare financials all that much. What's happening in general, obviously, it's very expensive to provide healthcare. There's a lot of capital intensity. And there's a lot of administrative costs as well. And, so there are certainly challenges in both of those areas. Exactly what it tells me, I don't really know. That's part of this longer term story of per capita costs, or what can we do, what's going to happen, in terms of how much technology do you need in a doctor's office, and what level of technology do consumers want to have, versus, and how much, it's going to cost to keep administering the system, because we have an expensive system to administer, right? Most doctors' offices have pretty high overhead in terms of just getting paid. So both of those things are forces that will help shape the future of healthcare. They're areas that, if the technology is good and provides lots of health, then great. If it doesn't, then, we'll want to try and figure out how to squeeze it out. And administrative costs, we're always trying to figure out how to solve, but I'm not sure we'll ever do it. Ready up your call.
Would you speak a little more about why you said that those smaller cities are having faster growth, Kalispell, Bozeman, Hamilton? Does it have to do with the retirement population? Or?
It's both. I mean, a lot of it's just population, right? I mean, that's the simple story in, certainly in Bozeman. Billings Clinic just bought a bunch of land because they're sitting there saying, well, Bozeman's growing faster than any other place. Paul just showed you that. It's growing faster than any other place in Montana. And, if you just assume recent trends in population growth, Gallatin County will be bigger than Missoula County within 15 years. So, a lot of it's just population growth, but in part it is an additional part of it is this aging of the population. So, it's easy when the pie gets bigger in healthcare in a smaller area to make a go of it. It's not just retirees, no. It's just, and certainly in Bozeman, it's just the growth in general. But I would say that's probably true of all these places. With the exception of Great Falls, all the 7 counties in Montana are growing at above national average rates. So in population terms. So, a lot of it, more people, more healthcare. It's a pretty simple equation.
Okay, we got time for one more. Another question? Well, I'll be available after the break. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.